My name is Debbie Einhorn. I'm going to be presenting with Brennan's Cupidor and Alex Young, and we are going to be talking about green burial in New York City. Green burial is currently not available in New York City, so our project is going to be looking at the barriers and how it could possibly be introduced, especially for people who are becoming more sustainably aware.
Brilliant. So as Debbie just kind of touched on, our objective over the past semester has been to evaluate why there are no green burial options within NYC and also formulate the steps to overcome any legal or cultural barriers to their implementation. This is especially important now because NYC has currently been running out of space to bury the dead, and this is before COVID-19 hit. So new methods of disposition need to be investigated.
So what exactly is green burial? It's preparing a body without any chemicals, and then that body is then buried in a biodegradable coffin or shroud, usually 3 to 4 deep, to allow microbial activity versus the traditional 6 feet. And then there are 3 types of green burial grounds, as stated by the Green Burial Council, which is conservation land, and then that involves having the graves being hand dug, and there's usually no markers allowed, so the land remains in its natural state. There is natural burial grounds which only allow green burials, and then these cemeteries usually focus on minimizing waste and conserving energy, and then that really stresses that the caskets must be biodegradable, and any landscaping practices have to promote native vegetation. And then the last type of burial ground is a hybrid cemetery, which is just a traditional cemetery with a section that's solely devoted to green burials. And in our case for New York City, hybrid cemeteries would most likely be the best fit or most feasible course of action.
So putting all of this into kind of a contextual history, humans have been treating their dead in meaningful ways since time immemorial. The first image that you can see is essentially the Smithsonian recreation of what would have been like a Neanderthal burial thousands upon thousands of years ago. And as we move from prehistory into history, we can see that the ways in which human beings have treated their dead represented in a lot of the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and then of course Islam. And one of the things that has been fascinating in this research is that we're finding that a lot of the traditional ways of burying a body in the Jewish or Muslim tradition actually mirrors a lot of what you see in the modern green burial practices. Things like having a simple shroud, trying to not use as much embalming as we see in a lot of the Western nations. And a lot of these changes in embalming practices really happened during the late modern era, specifically during the late 19th century, as a lot of things became industrialized and mass practiced. Embalming, which up to a certain point in human history had been reserved for the elites or the nobles, became something that was incredibly commonized for specifically Union soldiers to send them back to their families during the war. So some of the reasons to reintroduce green burial, like I just said, there is kind of, I guess, a cultural swing back where we are seeing a lot of these traditional Orthodox practices becoming more popular, but not due to religious reasons, but due to the reasons that people are living more sustainably. They want to have a smaller eco footprint in life. So we think, why not allow them to have options to have a smaller eco footprint in death as well? Funeral directors need to serve any kind of public desire or cultural need that could arise. And as we've seen, this kind of demand has been growing throughout the past decade, 2 decades. And currently the nearest green cemetery is Irvington, New York, which is about 40 minutes away by car in Westchester County.
So what exactly does conventional burial use? So if we're talking about just caskets, we're talking about 90,000 tons of steel, 2,700 tons of copper and bronze, 30 million board feet of hardwood. And then if we add in vaults, which is not mandatory according to New York State, but many individual cemeteries do mandate it. We are adding another 1.6 million tons of reinforced concrete, 14,000 tons of steel. And then if we're talking about embalming, which is also not mandated by New York State, but it is a fairly common practice, we are adding another 4.3 million gallons of embalming fluid to the earth. And then if we are talking about the cemetery, how the upkeep of the cemetery land itself, we are adding more pesticides and fertilizers. It's very water intensive and it's very energy intensive. So this is why we need to invest in greener and more sustainable alternatives.
We use two websites just for mapping the cemeteries and then the park spaces within the 5 boroughs, Oasis NYC, and then the New York City Planning website, or ZOLA for short. So on the map we have on this slide, the cemeteries are marked up by the yellowish spaces, and then the municipal park spaces are in green. And then, so using both of these websites, we compiled a Excel spreadsheet of about 160 block and lots, and then those belong to about 100 cemeteries. And then we use that information to discern exactly how many square footage each cemetery has currently, and then as well as contact information for when we do interviews. And then on the next slide, we have maps of each borough. So each borough has a specific square mile perimeter, and then within each borough, the cemeteries, I've sort of just compiled them together and then marked up the spaces in red of which each borough has cemeteries. So for example, Queens, the middle map on the bottom, all of the cemeteries in Queens can fit maybe 1/5 of the Rockaway Peninsula. And then I also looked up the total municipal park square mileage as well. And then that was about 40 square miles. And then that's just a little under 40% of Queens.
So what are other green disposition methods? There are 3 other really green disposition methods, meaning they don't give off any kind of emissions, which is promession, biomethanization, and natural organic reduction. Natural organic reduction is a type of composting, and we can see the process in the image to the right. There is also a 4th disposition method here called alkaline hydrolysis, which is not completely green, but it is more green than, say, cremation. It uses 1/4 of the energy and emits 1/4 of the emissions. So if you had a choice between cremation and alkaline hydrolysis, you should choose alkaline hydrolysis. However, none of these are approved in New York State. So getting any of these approved in New York State would be a great step forward. We have sent out a survey, mostly to City College students, with the goal being to find out how familiar people are with their disposition, and how familiar they are with just talking about death in general. And about half of them are aware of their family's wishes. About half have heard of green burial before, and a very nice 84% would suggest looking into green burial to a friend or family member if it would come up in conversation. So this is all good steps towards opening the conversation about green burial and taking steps to actually implement it in New York. So one of the issues that we did touch upon was the space issue. There's not enough space in New York City. And for this, we would say our solution would be that maybe parks and cemeteries should be combined. And so this was one of the questions in the survey. And a very nice 72% said, yes, they would feel comfortable with this. So again, this is a good step in the right direction for our project. And lastly, Hart Island is an island off of Bronx, New York. It is currently a potter's field for New York City, which means anyone who does not have the means to be buried privately can be buried here. and any unidentified remains are also buried here. It has recently come under the jurisdiction of the Parks Department, so we are hoping that it will open up to the public, hopefully soon, but obviously that remains to be seen. Our next steps will include talking to various stakeholders and city officials to see how we can kind of make this happen. Thank you. That was our presentation. We hope you enjoyed.
Wonderful. Thanks, team. So what I'll do now is just ask that our guest reviewers make themselves visible and unmuted, and we'll open it up to them for questions and comments first, and then the whole Zoom. Jen, do you want to start?
Sure. First of all, this is fascinating. This is like maybe one of the only areas of sustainability I've never really thought a huge amount about.
Mm-hmm.
So I love this. I think, wow, like great awareness exercise. A couple of questions I had, and I don't know if you researched this at all or if it came up in what you've been looking at, but do all green burials, is there always the idea that this should be a memorial park, or are there a subsector of people who say, hey, dispose of me in a green way and stick me under a building because land is really valuable? I know that sounds dumb, but it's even greener in some cases to just say, I don't really need a presence either. I'm just putting that out there. And also in your surveys, it seems like it would be interesting to, and maybe you have done, try and understand, like based on religion, you know, which of these green burial practices are applicable to the different religions.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done anything like that?
Yes. So religion was a very big part of our survey. Well, Jewish and Muslim practices do require that a body be buried and just in a simple shroud without embalming. So we feel that they would be generally more inclined to accept burial. But in general, there was a lot of people, there were people from many different religions who answered our survey. And they, even if they felt that they themselves were not religious, they still felt that religion was a big part of the death services. So it's definitely going to play a big part, but we don't think it's going to be a huge obstacle.
Mm.
Interesting.
Kevin, do you have any questions or comments?
Well, I mean, I think you're not quite specifying what your model of, like, where's the problem arise? And I think you've got it in your head, and I can guess at what it is. But I mean, right, that there's sort of, on one hand, policymakers don't allow this, and on the other hand, people don't want it necessarily, or don't know that it's available to want, and so I'm just trying to sort of clarify, like, where do you see, what is your sort of, you know, what is the main issue here, do you think? Is it more, I don't know.
People definitely are less aware of their options when it comes to what's going to happen to their body after they die. I think it's just that it's a sensitive topic, and no one really likes to think that they are going to die and that their body will end up somewhere in the earth.
Most likely polluting it.
Right. So yes, part of this is raising awareness and education about people's options, but another part of that would be to go to the lawmakers and say, were you aware of this, and would you be amenable to change the law to allow some of these practices?
And furthermore, it's not just that you know, this is an issue that, you know, is kind of in our heads. We've seen, you know, there have been New York Times articles within the past month or so about the rising need of space and the lack thereof of space to bury bodies in New York City. And there's an incredible strain on the mortuary system right now, both within our city and across the country. So as we're kind of growing and pushing forward through this pandemic, through this crisis, we're going to need to learn not only how are things going to change, but that there is a logistic need for things to change, and we have a potential solution, or how can solutions potentially be applied. So this is essentially what I think we're going for here right now. But COVID absolutely was not on our radar when we began this project, and we're kind of just pushing through it like everybody else.
Well, because there's also the industry, the mortuary industry, and I don't know if you're going to be talking with people within that to try to figure out how that slots in.
We're
Our
definitely gonna
supervisor
try.
certainly has a great connections with the industry.
Okay, good.
So I've got one more question. What is like next steps for you guys? You have summer and next semester to wrap this up. What is your final deliverable? What are you hoping the outcome of this capstone is?
So definitely a big part of it is an awareness, but also we are hoping to get in touch with some city officials and some funeral directors and cemeteries and see why this has yet to be implemented and what steps the city would need to take in order to implement green burial within the city.
So can I jump in with a couple of questions? It's Hillary.
Sure.
No, really an intriguing initiative, and a couple of things that I think you should maybe consider going forward. You know, you itemized the reduction. You actually itemized the cost. Sorry, the materials involved in conventional burial. One of the ways you can potentially make this argument, you know, to not make too fine a point on it, is a kind of cost benefit. And I don't know whether there's an opportunity to get access to numbers. And so I would suggest, you know, you at least make that consideration. But as you itemized the things that we wouldn't need to do with implementation of green burial, then you might actually create, and this would be something for the legislature, New York City carbon reduction equivalents. If you wanted to make it in that as some metric that could speak. The last question I have is, I think it's really important that you enumerate who the stakeholders are.
Yes.
Sure.
Because yeah, we understand that there are obstacles, but it would really be useful to have you itemize them, and, you know, maybe a matrix or something that gives you a head start on how to strategize.
So Brennan actually, I don't know, he briefly mentioned this, but there is actually a Excel spreadsheet, hundreds of lines long, with all the cemeteries and funeral directors in the city. And we have identified a couple of city officials that we would like to talk to. And then there's also Melinda Hunt, who is the director of the Hart Island project, who may have some interesting takes on green burial in Hart Island.
Okay. One other question that was in my mind right from the get-go. So I assume that the modus operandi of a green burial is that you are placed without markers. Is that always the case, or do some people opt for some kind of marker?
It is not always the case. That is the most extreme case. So green burial, it can be done in one of three ways. The most extreme case being in a conservation land where it's just, you're buried cleanly in a shroud, no embalming, 3 to 4 feet deep, and there's no marker. It's usually
or a natural marker like a stone or a tree, something like
Right.
that. That could be.
Okay,
Right.
yeah.
But then the next level up would be to the same green burial in a very biodegradable shroud or casket, but with a marker, and with some landscaping in the surrounding area.
Mhm.
And then the third and least restrictive type of green burial would be green burial in a plot, in a regular traditional cemetery. So it would be in a regular cemetery in a whatever city, and that cemetery would just have a section devoted to green burial.
Okay. Good. Thanks for that clarification. And just one little coda to what I was thinking about with the metrics of carbon reduction equivalent. Cremation is extremely energy intense.
True.
And I think if you want to pitch this to New York City, get the statistics. How many are cremated? How many are conventionally buried? And you can create some kind of an evaluation of the material and energy costs.
Debbie, would you like to tackle that for a sec?
Well, we do know that about 50% of people, give or take, are cremated. The thing with New York City is that there is not a lot of space left for people to be buried. There's around 5,000 spaces left. They're going to be out of burial spaces within the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So they really need to tackle this space issue if they want to continue burying people within the city, which we think is extremely important, because you wouldn't want to force people out of the city to visit their loved ones and incur extra costs and incur extra emissions from having to drive outward.
And you said how many people die annually per year in New York City? Around 50,000, is that correct?
Around 50,000 people die in New York City a year.
So if we could think about it, it would be, 50% of 50,000 is 25,000, and then we would have to multiply whatever individual metric we find from cremation, just multiply that by about approximately 25,000.
Yeah, not to be too crude about it, but I think the metrics are important. If you
No, you're right.